The night was a tempest, with dark clouds swirling ominously overhead and the wind howling like a banshee. Angry waves crashed against the hull of the USS Beale, a destroyer on patrol in the stormy waters north of Cuba. The date, October 16, 1962. A day that would soon be etched into the annals of history. The Cold War was at its frostiest, with tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union reaching a fever pitch. The crew, tense and alert, scanned the radar screens. Suddenly a blip appeared, sending a jolt of adrenaline through the room. An unidentified submarine was detected, lurking just below the surface, its intentions unknown. This was no ordinary sub. It was a Soviet diesel-electric submarine, a silent predator in the deep.
The captain of the Beale knew the stakes. He ordered his men to track the submarine's every move. Sonar operators strained to listen through the roar of the storm, hoping to pinpoint the sub's location. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation, every second feeling like an eternity.
The Cold War, with its ever-present threat of nuclear annihilation, had reached a critical juncture. The Beale maintained a cautious distance, following the submarine's every turn. The crew understood the gravity of the situation. They were the first line of defense against a potential nuclear threat. The fate of the world, it seemed, hung in the balance. Every decision, every action could tip the scales towards peace or catastrophe. The storm raged on, mirroring the turmoil that was about to engulf the world. The crew of the Beale braced themselves for what was to come. The following morning, President John F. Kennedy awoke to a world teetering on the precipice. The air was thick with tension. A chilling report from the CIA lay on his desk, confirming his worst fears. The intelligence was clear and undeniable. The Soviet Union had secretly placed nuclear missiles on the island of Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida. The missiles, capable of reaching major American cities within minutes, posed an unprecedented threat to the United States.
Kennedy, known for his cool demeanor, was shaken to his core. The gravity of the situation was unlike anything he had ever faced. The world had never been closer to nuclear war. The specter of global annihilation loomed large. The president immediately convened a meeting of his closest advisors, a group that would become known as XCOM. The room was heavy with the weight of responsibility. Every decision carried immense significance.
The advisors debated fiercely. Some argued for an immediate airstrike, while others advocated for caution. Kennedy listened intently, his face etched with worry. The weight of the world seemed to rest on his shoulders. The Cuban Missile Crisis had begun. For 13 agonizing days, the world watched and waited. The photographs presented to President Kennedy were irrefutable, showing Soviet missile sites under construction in Cuba, just 90 miles from the US coast. The images were chilling, long, sleek missiles pointed menacingly towards the US mainland. The threat was immediate and undeniable. The crisis was no longer a suspicion. It was a terrifying reality that demanded swift and decisive action. Kennedy, faced with this unprecedented threat, maintained his composure, understanding the gravity of the situation. He knew that a measured response was needed, one that would deter the Soviets without escalating the crisis further. The world watched with bated breath, the specter of nuclear war looming large. Every decision was scrutinized by a global audience. The stakes had never been higher, the tension palpable. People everywhere felt the weight of the potential catastrophe. The discovery of the missiles sent shockwaves across the globe, shaking the very foundations of international relations. President Kennedy, after careful deliberation with his advisors, decided on a course of action.
He would impose a naval blockade on Cuba, preventing Soviet ships from delivering any further military equipment to the island.
This quarantine, as Kennedy called it, was a calculated risk, a show of force designed to pressure the Soviets without resorting to direct military action. The world watched as American warships took up positions around Cuba, their guns trained on the horizon.
The tension was almost unbearable. Every passing ship, every distant blip on the radar screen was scrutinized for any sign of Soviet defiance.
The world held its breath, bracing for a confrontation that could ignite a global conflict. The quarantine had an immediate impact. Soviet ships loaded with weapons and supplies approached the quarantine line, then stopped.
The world held its breath, caught in the grip of a tense standoff. The fate of the world seemed to hinge on the decisions of the captains of those ships, on whether they would obey the quarantine or challenge the American blockade.
The quarantine was more than just a military maneuver. It was a message, a clear signal to the Soviet Union that the United States would not tolerate the presence of nuclear missiles in its backyard. The world watched and waited, hoping against hope that the message would be received and that the crisis could be resolved peacefully. As the days turned into nights, the tension in the White House was palpable. President Kennedy and his advisors worked around the clock, fueled by coffee and the fear of an unthinkable catastrophe. The weight of the world rested on their shoulders, the fate of millions hanging in the balance.
The world watched, waited, and prayed. Publicly, Kennedy projected an image of calm determination, but privately he was grappling with the enormity of the crisis.
He knew that any misstep, any miscalculation could have catastrophic consequences. The world listened to his every word, searching for clues, for hope, for any sign that the crisis could be averted.
Across the globe, people huddled around radios and televisions, desperate for news. The Cuban Missile Crisis, once a distant threat, had become a terrifying reality. Families huddled in fear, wondering if this was the end.
The world prayed for peace, but prepared for the worst. The threat of nuclear war was not an abstraction, not a theoretical possibility. It was real, it was imminent, and it terrified people on both sides of the Iron Curtain. The world watched with bated breath, united in fear as the two superpowers stood on the brink.